All right, welcome to our kickoff ceremony of sorts for Earth Week. My name is Adam Theta, Director of Ecological Relationships, which I think everybody knows here because I know all of you all. Today we are going to, our theme for this week is 150 years of PHJC ecology as we're commemorating the 150 years of the Sisters in the Americas this year. So with that as a theme of the week, today was going to kind of start with the Potawatomi presence in this area. We're going to focus on a very local history, not the entire state or whatever. And I fudged on the 150 years a little bit to get back to the early 19th century. So nobody but the hecklers over here should care about that, but go easy on me for that. So this is a presentation I developed for the Lampin lecture in February, and I'm going to give kind of an abbreviated version. So I'm going to maybe spend a little extra time in the beginning because today is kind of the Potawatomi kind of pre-European day, and then I'll maybe skip through some of the stuff towards the back end because we'll get to those later. So Tuesday, our theme is going to move on to European settlement kind of in the 19th century. Wednesday is going to be 20th century changes, Thursday is going to be present day, and Friday is going to be future. Slide, please. Next slide. Got it? Okay, so that's a basic outline for the talk and kind of for the week. Next slide. So who were the Potawatomi? They were the last in a series of peoples who lived in this area pretty much ever since the glaciers retreated maybe 10, 15,000 years ago. There were people on the continent. So when we speak of kind of the natural state of the land here, natural 15,000 years ago was a block of ice half a mile thick above where you're standing right now. And as soon as that receded, the vegetation and the soil development kind of took place and peoples inhabited the area. So at the time of what we call European contact, this was the language group of the Ojibwe, the Algonquin people group. And of that, there was maybe 30-some languages, and the Potawatomi was one of those. Next slide. So this is, on the previous slide, that would have been, in the kind of indigenous cosmology, the Americas would have been Turtle Island. And so the Earth was placed on the back of a turtle. In the modern scientific cosmology that I'm reading the landscape with all of these squares and straight lines, this is kind of a physiographic map, what we call a physiographic map. And in the bottom where it gets kind of squiggly there, south of Indianapolis towards Bloomington, you guys have been down there, you know that the land is very much rolling. That's essentially where the glaciers stopped. The last glaciation, of course, there was another one 100,000 years ago before that. So as a consequence, Indiana, from basically Indianapolis up, is known for being very flat. Very good farmland because of all of the glacial till that was moved by the glaciers, deposited and then weathered in place, made very good for agriculture, abundant and regular rainfall. To the north west part of the state, totaling a couple million acres, is kind of what we call the Prairie Peninsula, peninsula of the prairie ecosystem that was into Indiana, and that kind of graded into oak savanna, open marsh. In the northeastern part of the state was kind of what they call half woods, half water, kind of dense, dark forest, but also patches that were open. That's Indiana's lakes region, if you will. And through the middle, very flat, very good soil, which as a consequence has very little forest left because with European settlement, that's where the best farmland was and where people started farming first. Next slide. So over here in western Marshall County, where we are on that red dot, is right basically on the line between the Kankakee Drainage Way, which began the enormous swamp and prairie to our west, and the Plymouth Morainal Complex, other moraines off to the east, which is more what we think of forest. So we're pretty much right in the middle of the continental divide in terms of the forest ecosystem, grading over to the prairie ecosystem. So pretty much everything west of here was originally to Colorado, essentially to the Rockies, was much more open, and to the east was kind of more what we call closed or more forested. Next slide. And if you zoom in on some of these maps that they have, depends on which one you look at. There's one line over there and one line here, and we're pretty much smack dab right on the middle. On the western part of our property, we have prickly pear cactus growing wild in the ditch. That is an indicator species for essentially prairie and savanna habitat. And if you go east from here, you're really not going to find hardly any of that. Next slide. So the one of the primary, we rely on a lot of documents from the Europeans who made the first contacts with traders, trappers, and surveyors. And a lot of those were written down in kind of original documents and then compiled over the time. One of the best documents was this book called The Potawatomi's Keepers of the Fire. And they self-identify as fire keepers or keepers of the fire, kind of within all of their bands across kind of the Midwest. And this is a really great book, and I'm just going to kind of read an excerpt or two from that to kind of give us a picture of what the lifestyle was like, because myself, as a product of public education, we have these kind of ideas of what we think of, grow up playing Indians and cowboys, or Native Americans, were these people that lived a long time ago, until I realized, oh, there's still 4,000 or 5,000 Potawatomi left in the Pokagon band in the area here. And to learn how they live, and even our scientific kind of understanding of how they use the landscape changes every time we have an archaeological dig and new information is kind of synthesized and put through the literature. So I'm just going to kind of read some of these descriptions to kind of give us kind of an idea of what life was like on this land here. The Potawatomi life followed the rhythm of the seasons. During the summer, the Indians formed large villages, usually along streams or rivers, where Potawatomi women planted small fields of beans, peas, squashes, pumpkins, melons, and tobacco. They also raised an abundance of corn, which was traded to the French or the more northern tribes. Crops from their fields were supplemented by a variety of products the Indians gleaned from nearby lakes and forests. Wild rice was harvested when available, as many types of nuts, roots, and berries. In the spring, they collected maple sugar, which they extensively used as a condiment. So all of these things that they were harvesting, the Americas, I believe there are a couple places in the Americas, in the Andes, kind of towards Bolivia, and Mesoamerica, were two of the roughly 10 or 12 origins of agriculture on the planet. And that was kind of a hotbed for the origin of those. So all those crops and plants there, even stuff that we now think of as iconically from other regions, like Italy. You can't imagine kind of Italy without a tomato today. Well, there were no tomatoes in Italy at all until the first Europeans came back and brought those products. Same thing, we were the wild turkey and the domestic turkey. The turkey was domesticated in Mesoamerica. They think, this is kind of more recent research, they think as far back as 2,000 years ago. So about the time of Christ was when they think that was first domesticated. So it really was a lifestyle of a combination of hunting, gathering, and agriculture, such that it was diversified, that they didn't rely strictly on one. And as you had seasonal abundance of one species, you would go like gangbusters to get as much calories or put as much away as you could, as that was seasonally abundant. And then during the winter, it says they dispersed into smaller family-related villages or hunting camps scattered throughout their territory. In the cold months, they depended more heavily on hunting, tracking animals, especially deer, through the snow, and relied on food stored from the summer and upon migratory waterfowl, which had been killed and preserved during the autumn. They practiced a type of agriculture that, this is before kind of the Industrial Revolution, obviously, and modern fertilizers and whatever, and the things that we use. So we call that extensive agriculture versus intensive. So really wide and extent with a few inputs. So you would clear an area of brush and scrub, burn it down, plant as many crops as you can get in there before the soil is depleted, and then as soon as the yields start dropping, you move on to the next patch. So rather than just one field continually harvesting year after year, you have this patchwork of, okay, we're going to plant here for 3-4 years, then we're going to move over here, move over here. So you can see even with a small population that would have a fairly large footprint, and it would create this really rich mosaic of habitat around them because you have cleared field, you have kind of grassy weeds and then scrub and then growing up into trees. And one of the first things you learn in ecology is that all these different plants and animals and species rely on different types of habitat. So humans using the land here basically were kind of a biodiversity multiplier. It was rather than thinking of the impact of something negative, it was very much largely creating the conditions of microhabitats across Indiana. Another thing that we, go ahead and go to the next slide. Another thing that also kind of has come in through the academic literature in the last couple decades and now kind of into the popular conversation is the use of fire. I was kind of growing up in the Smokey the Bear age where fire is bad. Only you can prevent forest fires. Fire hurts things, it hurts trees, it kills them. And then now we realize that fire, in fact, has a very deep history, especially in the American continent, in almost every single habitat. Now, they maybe occurred at different frequencies, but there are very few, I would say even very few habitats within the American continent that fire was not used. And a lot of that we think is anthropogenic, so human originated versus of course, there were wildfires as well from lightning strikes, but fire was used for all kinds of purposes, especially when you clear an area with fire, it's going to have a really lush regrowth at the ground level. If you're relying with your primary protein on hunted game, they're going to congregate in the area that has a really fresh, nutritious growth. And this is, they knew this, and it's confirmed with modern kind of grazing science that if you keep a plant within that kind of intermediate stage of not getting large and seeded out and tough and not being grazed down to kind of the nub, that's the most productive in terms of pounds per acre that you can get out of vegetation. That's what kind of the most kind of attentive grazers will do. And that's essentially the conditions that they were creating to maximize the number of animals, elk, bison, and other species for hunting. Next slide. So some of the early travelers also had descriptions of the landscape. And again, this is what we rely on to kind of put together a mental model of what the area looked like, because we have kind of these models in our mind. And sometimes when you read these, you kind of realize how off those kind of impressions are in your mind. This was from a trader who was on the Elkhart River in 1809, so not far from here. 18 miles further, you come into the Elkhart River, a branch of the St. Joseph's in Michigan, and for 8 miles before you come to the river, you come into a thicket of young hickories and oaks about as thick as a man's thumb and growing so close together that it is impossible to penetrate it at any other place than by the road. The land is as rich as any is in Kentucky, and there's no doubt but that it would be fruitable if cultivated. So if there's this really dense thicket of only, thumb-sized hickories and oaks, that means it was not a, large kind of what we think of old growth forest. It was a place that had been kind of raised or grazed for some period of time, and then for whatever reason let to grow up, maybe to be replenished, or maybe there was a conflict with a neighboring group and human populations were moving around, whatever reason. But the picture that I get of Indiana is this more of this kind of patchwork of habitat across the state. Another one they said when they crossed the river, now let's move to the, here's the Kankakee. And this is way back in 1679, an account from Father Louis Hennepin, a Recollect friar. He was describing this in December of 79. The river Signalay is navigable for canoes to within 100 paces of its source, and it increases to such an extent in a short time that it is almost as broad and deeper as the Marne. It takes its course through vast marshes, through where it winds about so, though its current is plenty strong, that after sailing on it for a whole day, we sometimes found that we had not advanced more than 2 leagues in a straight line, and as far as the eye could reach, nothing was seen but marshes full of flags and alders. And they talked about how this is the Kankakee drainage way, so flat and so vast, there was not any dry land, and they would travel these large sinuous paths and practically get lost because there was nowhere to sleep, nowhere to make camp except out on a frozen hummock of something out in the marsh. So it really was a very different kind of environment that we have today. I put this picture up just to kind of think about, moving about the landscape and following the resources versus kind of our modern, to some degree we still do follow resources, but now that we have these international trade networks, it's much more convenient to import something we have a shortage of. And I look at this and I think of the mortgage note that I have on my house. So I moved to Plymouth for economic reasons. It was when I started working as a consulting botanist, it was a full-time job with benefits, and I had another child on the way. So I moved here for economic reasons and started renting a place, and then I felt comfortable enough and liked the area. I got a big fat mortgage and keep paying that down for 15 or 30 years or however long. And I love my house. I love where we're at. But if things change, I can't just get up and move my house, certainly not very cheaply. If there's a flood, it's going to get flooded out and have all kinds of damage, which we've seen. Whereas the wigwam and the other structures that they have could be assembled by a team of people, maybe in an afternoon or a day. Yes, it didn't have central air or heating or Wi-Fi or anything else, but if a place became, if another place had an abundance of resources, you could be very mobile. And, I'm dedicating 15 to 30 years of my labor towards this one fixed structure that if there's some sort of economic downturn, I'm just going to have to take a bath on. So it kind of makes you wonder, about the wisdom of the different styles of inhabiting the land. But next slide. So just kind of a little bit of a timeline we're going to move kind of next out of the Potawatomi period to kind of the cusp of European colonization. So there were reservations in Marshall County, a reservation kind of on the south and west of Plymouth. That was about 1830. Sister Mary and I went down to the Historic Museum. They have all these maps available. You can see these. And the European settlement also coincided with the loss of most of the megafauna, the large mammals from the state. That's also the time that they started doing the land surveys. So the European model of intensive agriculture and a settled lifestyle, if you wanted that as a structure for your culture, you had to define precisely where your land was versus someone else's land because it was not a communal setup. So you had to have these land surveys. You had to have all these straight lines kind of drawn throughout the landscape. And Sister Mary will be sharing more with us about that tomorrow. So you do not want to miss it. Tomorrow at noon, Sister Mary, the land surveyor, is going to be stopping by. And then we'll get to and this is, several decades before the Porhaymates first arrive in Fort Wayne. Next slide. Next slide. So 1938, it was a few years after the first land surveys, was what's known as the Potawatomi Trail of Death, and this is kind of a mimic or a replay of the more commonly or widespread known Trail of Tears. But it was Chief Menominee refusing to cede his land, and so the Potawatomi rounded up by force and left at a site near Plymouth, just a few miles outside of Plymouth, which is the site of a memorial that was erected in 1909, which I'll have to look up to be sure, so I'm not spreading more falsehoods. But I think it was one of the first statues or memorials to any Native American using state or federal funds or something like that. But it was 1909, so it's been up there over 100 years. They marched on foot to Kansas. and that was in the fall, September to November. There was a young Catholic priest named Father Benjamin Pettit who walked the entire path with them and made it to Kansas with them, and then actually died on the way back. But of course, at that time, without modern medicine and travel and everything else, there were several elderly people and children, anybody else that was sick, died along the route. There was a story of a Miami Indian man who went to the general when they were getting round up, and he said, "Hey, I'm not Potawatomi, I'm Miami." And for whatever reason, because it was specific to his military instructions, whatever else, he said, "Okay, go hide in the barn till we're gone." And he hid in the loft, and it was reported that he lived out the rest of his life near Rochester for decades later. So there's all kinds of stories like that. But anyway, the Father Benjamin Pettit kept a record of a journal of his travels that exists, and you can. The Historical Society in Rochester has a lot of this information. And one of my professors at Indiana Wesleyan, a religious professor, retraced these steps in about 2006. He walked on foot, tennis shoes, to Kansas. He's an interesting man. He's a walker. He walked the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail. He's like, I'm going to take the summer and walk to Kansas. Stopping by neighbor and kind of walked through the journals with Father Pettit, and then ended up meeting with some of the Potawatomi that exist to this day in a band in Kansas, and had a meal with them and wrote a self-published book of his experience. Next slide. And there's 60 or 70 of those signs from here down to Logansport all the way out to Kansas. Next slide. This is the original photo from 1909 of the unveiling of the monument outside of Plymouth. Next slide. Okay, so moving into Indiana just celebrated our 200th, our bicentennial. I need at least a groan here. I didn't come up with that joke, by the way. I'm a Hoosier boy. I love our state. But our state seal is still to this day a European chopping down a nice oak tree with a bison fleeing into the distance. But at this time, if I would have been born at that time, that would have been me. The land was unused. And it was rich in its potential, but only its potential under the European intensive agricultural model. And that is fundamentally incompatible with the needs of large mammals to have, for large predators to have prey, and the herbivores to be roaming about the state is not compatible with if you're trying to grow extensive fields of corn and wheat and orchards and everything else. So, next slide. Among the animals that were, next slide, please. I'll just mention briefly the animals that were here that were extirpated at that time, meaning not extinct as a species, but gone from the state, included the bison, elk, whose shoulders would have been, higher than my head here, mountain lions, wolves, beavers, and otters were extirpated, trapped for their furs. Deer were actually, it's hard to believe now, but deer were actually completely gone from the state, and were until after World War II, I believe. Turkey, I think, were also extirpated. And this is a one of the early land survey. You see everything kind of chopped up into squares, so that's why in Indiana we have roads every mile, is that these are sections. So a section is a single square mile, typically 640 acres. And on the section lines is where we have most of our major roads. In Marshall County, east to west, it's named with a series of trees in alphabetical order. And then north to south is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Next slide. So Sister Mary and I took a trip to the Marshall County Museum and compared some of these early records with modern soil maps, which was kind of a fun exercise. Next slide. We're looking at the old documents on microfilm. and I certainly can't read it from there, but it says Township 33, North Range 1, 2nd Meridian, and that's all essentially what we've, if you look on your property card for at the county of your land records, it talks about which section and range and everything else. That's how you locate yourself within the state. And they use these units of measurement called a chain. A chain was actually literally a chain that was 66 feet long, that when you were doing a survey, you would get your corner post and you would haul that chain 66 feet and drop it, and then stick another post and move it until you got 80 chains, which was a mile. And along the way, you were surveying this land in order to see what was suitable for agriculture. So if something was a sandy hill, kind of hummock with poor vegetation, you would write down, this is third-rate barrens. This is no good. You're not going to be able to get much milk off of this land, right? Because milk comes from cows. Cows get to eat the grass. We need something with some water, but not too much, okay? If you go into a big marsh, you're kind of, okay, this is not the best either. Maybe we could do some muck farming, some onions and celery, but it's not kind of prime land, okay? So along the way, they made these observations. So this one is walking east from the corner of 9th Road and Union. And it says, after 27 chains, there was a marsh rolling and springy. So if you go, 27 chains is approximately a quarter mile. And go to the next slide. Next slide. And on the far left there is that intersection. And I got on Google Maps and went a quarter mile that way where the first star is. And if you look at the soil maps, the dark colors are wetland soil, the green colors are upland soil, and sure enough, it matches with our modern soil maps exactly those records from 1830. It says marsh, and if you're driving 9th Road that way, you notice the road dips down, and if you know the vegetation, you see that it shifts to wetland vegetation, you start seeing cattails and everything else. At 40 chains, a half mile, that second star said that there was a white oak, 17 inches in diameter, no other tree kind of around. There's a single tree out there, probably on a little bit of a hill or a hummock within the wetland. We know that white oak species, unlike kind of black or red oak, can stand a little bit wetter soil, so that makes sense. And that tree obviously is no longer there because there's the road there. But as you're reading through these notes, it kind of, again, we're trying to paint a picture of a history that is kind of only incomplete in our minds. And the more information that we're digging through these records, record of what plant species are there, gives us that information. Next slide. And continuing on 9th Road till there's a rise in the road, he mentions that it comes out of the marsh, and that's, I kind of did my measurements, and it's about exactly, again, where that wetland soil exits. Next slide. So we just have a few minutes left, maybe 10 minutes left here. And so we'll just keep kind of chugging along. And do we have any questions here first before we kind of move on? I forgot to mention that certainly would love to just kind of keep this interactive. Yeah, Barb? I believe there is a record. I can't say off the top of my head. I think there were around 800 that were on the march. I want to say at least dozens that probably died on the way. That's also a reminder, I'm trying to remember. They estimate the pre-European human population within the modern state of Indiana to be around 200,000, and the number of acres per person at approximately 5 to 1. So remember, this is extensive agriculture, not intensive. So it takes 5 acres, if you have a family of 4 or whatever, thinking for the nuclear family, not probably how they were thinking, 20 acres, kind of in their kind of extensive agriculture. So if you multiply that across the state, 5 to 1, that's 1 million acres. The state is approximately 25 million acres. So about 5% of the state in the pre-European was in agriculture at various stages. And I believe they estimate after that point, and this is maybe more of a continental estimation, one thing that really affected the first Europeans' reports of the land that we think, especially me as growing up in Indiana, I'm thinking, okay, Turkey Run, Shade State Park, these cool, dark, forest with these big old trees. What I did not know was that when the Europeans made first contact, even they wouldn't have had to make contact with those direct people, but as diseases transmitted among populations, they brought smallpox, and I'm drawing a blank on the other various communicable diseases that were brought from the old world into the new world that they did not have resistance to. The population loss was estimated to be as high as 90%. 90% of the people on the American continent, they expect, died from these diseases, which they had just no resistance from. And so when you have an extensive agriculture, if you have, a loss of population, so that would have been an average, but you would have entire areas that would have been completely depopulated of humans, and would have taken many, many years to have got back to that size of population. And so what would have happened to the vegetation? It would have been regrowing, because that would have been kind of in this perpetual state of being raised and kind of burned and managed. We would have seen the woody species kind of take off. And I have to verify this again. I remember reading, I'll just keep spreading some more falsehoods, that the regrowth was so strong in North America that record is discernible within, I don't know whether they're using tree rings or ice cores, within the CO2 concentration on the planet, because North America is such a large continent and has such an influence on that in terms of vegetation, that there was such a loss of human life that subsequent regrowth of the vegetation. So when the Europeans came in the 19th century to settle in large numbers, they would have seen land that had been for 100, 200 years in that regrowth period. So what in their minds is this kind of virgin continent, or the natural state of a woods. It kind of plays with your idea of what we think of, what's the word natural mean? What is a natural state in an area that has always been inhabited, always for all intents and purposes been inhabited by humans for 10,000 years. So the 20th century, so kind of at the cusp, so going forward up to about 1900, there were a series of soil surveys done throughout the state in each county. And this is available online, and it's in very layman's terms and not very long. Makes a really, really interesting read. They have the 1904 Marshall County Soil Survey. And again, they're thinking a soil survey in terms of agriculture production. They noted at the time that the small forest reserves or woodlots are about the only spots not at present under cultivation in the county. So the wetlands, the undrained places were not in cultivation. The real sandy ridges, like we have probably over at Moontree, they may have tried for a couple years unsuccessfully, or tried to plant some alfalfa, then would have died in a drought. And they said 75% of the land in the county is in cultivation or conditions to be cultivated. And what's interesting is that is essentially the same percentage that it is today. So about the past 100 years plus, really the net area of land within the county under cultivation has been the same. We haven't had a net loss or addition of forested cover or wetlands or woods. Next slide. So this is the Lake Galbraith and Flat Lake on this map, and around the outside you see MIS, which stands for Mississippi Sand. So boy, they got to the western half of this county and said, this is just terrible land. It's all sandy. There's hills everywhere. There's wetlands and water. And I wasn't a farmer back then, so I can say this, that I'm really glad that's all there, because that's the only reason that it's still around. And go to the next slide, and I'll show you the difference between, this was just an indication of the prickly pear cactus that is characteristic of that sand. Next slide. And it survives just fine in the roadside. It gets lopped off and just scabs over and heals and puts up another pad, and you can go over there and take a few pads and propagate it. Next slide. So the western half of the county, it's interesting reading the reports, because they said their barns really need painting. Their kids are just kind of dressed scraggly. They're all poor in the western, but in the eastern half, they're so industrious. Their farms are doing so good. Well, were the people really any different? No. It was the land that they had. So it's kind of the roll of the dice. If you had land in the eastern half of the county, You just had that much more of a base for the type of economic system that was developed. And they also said so there was a heavy growth of timber in much of the county, and in order to clear that for agriculture as quick as possible, they had so much land in their estimation that really much of that timber was not bulldozed. Getting the Industrial Revolution in the wrong timeline there. Was basically chopped down and burned before it could be used for timber, because the timber required a certain amount of population and infrastructure to export that to markets, okay? So they cleared a lot before the timber industry really got up and going. And then they took kind of all the high-grade lumber and kind of the cream of the crop, and then probably a couple of them shut down, and there's a few kind of around doing forestry. But over time, as we've switched to intensive agriculture with synthetic fertilizers, modern kind of corn genetics, hybrid seeds, pesticides and herbicides, the yields went from 25 to 50 bushels per acre in the west, half of the county, to now 150 plus easily. Even in the drought of 2012, when everybody's talking about how horrible it was, that worst year in my lifetime in terms of precipitation would have been more than the best year in the 19th century because of the genetics of what they're planting now and the synthetic fertilizers. Also, the changes in the 20th century, again, were not about the gross amount of land cover in any area. It was mostly about the way that the area was being farmed. And this is a story familiar to basically all of our families here. The rotations went from a fairly diversified rotation of crops, peas, alfalfa, cucumbers for pickling. They said about every family had 2 to 5 acres of cucumbers. There's 7 pickling facilities in this area. Everybody had a milk cow. Everybody had a little apple orchard to make some apple jack. And all these different crops. Well, as that intensive agriculture continued and markets developed and began to specialize, you could no longer keep doing 10 crops at a time. You had to buy specialty equipment that was very expensive, so you had to divide that cost over a lot of acres. So as a consequence, the agriculture became very specialized, to whereas now we're producing a lot fewer crops, but in terms of gross calories or volume, it's more than ever. And also drainage was, once they started draining some of the wetlands, that brought more land into production. Next slide. So if you guys have seen a topographic map, you know that the lines represent changes in elevation. So the more lines that are on a certain area, the steeper the land is. So on the left, I don't know if you can see it from back there, the brown lines around Lake Galbraith, Flat Lake, the western half of the county are very close together, which means that there's a lot more rolling terrain, not as easy for agriculture. On the eastern half, you see hardly any of those lines. And we'll go to the next slide and look at an aerial. And this will kind of we'll kind of wrap up this subject, and that'll be it for today. This is a color-coded aerial that basically somebody took a photograph and ran it through a computer and discerned what was being planted out in the field. So yes, you're being watched at every moment. They know exactly what you're growing in the back of your yard. Take a guess what the yellow is. Corn, that one was pretty easy. Green, soybeans. Gray, Plymouth. Gray is for Plymouth or urban infrastructure. What about blue? Water, H2O. The pink, which is kind of hardly discernible, I heard, is pasture and hay fields. And then the kind of teal, light green, anybody know what that is? What's left? Forests. So you can see that kind of teal green is definitely more prominent on the left side, the west side of the county, than the east side. And it is like we said about the soil survey author's comments about the type of people or the type of farms. This is a legacy of 15,000 years ago. This is the history of the glaciers that scraped this side of the county more than the other side of the county, and those changes persist to this day. That is why we have more forest and turkey habitat deer habitat. On the western half of the county, the farming's the hunting is much better, and on the eastern half, is much more amenable to a large-scale farming operation. Next slide. And so all I had kind of left, I think, was more just kind of statistics about the 20th century changes in the farming economy, and it's a story that a lot of you are familiar with. A lot fewer and fewer farmers with larger and larger farms, the average age of which I think in our county is 53, which is actually younger than the national average, which is I think mid to upper 50s. And there are a surprisingly large number of farms that have basically no succession plan. No plan of where the farm will go when the existing farmer is finished, other than up on the auction block, which is a very interesting kind of demographic transition that we're facing. But I think due to the interest of time, we're going to stop there, and you will have to come back Tuesday through Friday to hear the rest of the story. So have any questions from any of that from today? Yes, May. Yeah. Bison, elk. I mean, I guess it depends on your definition of mega. Yes, there were elk here. Bison. There was an elk when they were doing dredging in the Kankakee. There were several times that they ran into elk racks that had fallen off and been preserved in the soil, essentially. So all those ones that I mentioned were extirpated. What I didn't get to is that a lot of those have since been reintroduced or recolonized on their own. Deer were reintroduced, turkey, otter. I don't think bobcat were ever maybe completely extirpated, but they're doing better. Bison, actually, the Nature Conservancy in Jasper County, or the next one over, is there one west yet, near Morocco? They have a enormous kind of 8,000 to 9,000 acre prairie restoration, and they've taken 1,000 acres of that and had some beefed up bison fence, and they brought in pure bison genetics from out west and have a small herd that they let kind of eat across the prairie as they see fit. And other than giving them vaccinations once a year, they kind of don't mess with them to try to restore those natural practices as much as possible. Yeah. Both. They actually said, when I guess I've toured some of these places in Illinois where they have them, they said technically the fences would hold elk and they'll do elk, but around here people see elk and they really want to shoot them. Whereas people around here see bison and go, oh, that's great, I'm so glad there's bison here, but they see an elk, they would potentially in these rural areas run into poaching issues. There also have been black bears spotted both in northern Indiana and southern Indiana. But again, it's a matter of the culture and the economics of the land use and the population. So with 6 million people in Indiana, we're not going to be seeing large populations of bears. Maybe a reproductive population in southern Indiana. Maybe one of them swam across wolves. You're not going to see wolves around here, but they may be passing through. There's certainly been mountain lions that have passed through the state. There's probably much more records of them supposedly seen than were actually seen. But there was a mountain lion from the Black Hills of the Dakotas who was hit by a car in Connecticut. So how did he get there? Probably didn't swim across the lakes, so he had to go north of Great Lakes and go across a bridge or something, or he came through Indiana.